Hey guys, it's Hannah over at Sherwood Forest Creations, and today we're going to be stitching the Winter's Night ornaments. If you're a first timer or you're a little rusty, make sure you go back and watch my embroidery basics video on my YouTube channel. That video is going to help you get started. This video is going to jump right into the stitching. Pay attention to the number of strands listed at the beginning of each section. If you don't know what I mean by the number of strands, then go back and watch that embroidery basics video. Before we get started, here's a few notes on tying off. When tying off on this hoop, it's going to be a little bit tight because it's such a small hoop, but this is how I like to weave in the back. So I'm just weaving through my existing stitches in the back of the hoop right now to secure my thread, and I'll just kind of work up the tree or in the stump, whatever is available. If you're in an area of the hoop where there's not a lot to tie off on, you can just slide underneath a single stitch once, then slide underneath it again, but don't pull all the way through. Leave a little bit of a loop there. Then if you just back up through that loop, it will create a knot. I'll do that one more time to create a second knot just to make sure that that thread is sturdy. Okay, let's get started. The stitching is going to be the same for every tree, just the sizing is different. You're going to want to start with the tree that looks like it's in the back. I'm starting with this tree on the right. Your patterns are in white because I found it was much easier to see on this fabric than the black. Make sure you have a good lighting source. We're going to be using 2 strands, and we're going to come up at the base of the outside of the stump, so the very bottom, and you're going to make a single stitch down that line. Make sure you're not pulling your thread too tight. You don't want your fabric to cinch. Now you're going to come up at the top of that left side stump line and dive down into the bottom. Now you're just going to be filling this space in with basically a messy satin stitch. So this does not need to be precise. The bottom line is going to be covered and the top line is going to be covered. So don't worry about accuracy here. What we're trying to do is just fill the space. So you'll see me go from bottom to top, and then I'll flip over to the other side and go top to bottom. That's just a nice way to conserve thread. I don't like to go top to bottom, bottom to top on the same side and go from left to right, because you could potentially rip through the fabric if you go down into one hole and then come up right next to it. So I like to go back and forth like I'm doing here. This also helps me keep this nice angle where both sides are angling in towards the center by hopping from one side to the other. Do not worry about these lines being perfect. The stumps are supposed to look kind of messy and ribbed because they're stumps, so it's kind of a bark look to it. So do not worry about your lines being perfectly straight or your stitches being perfect. And if there's any time where you make a stitch and you feel like, oh, that didn't really go all the way to the top like I just did there, don't worry about it. You can cover it with the next stitch. Now you'll see me throw down a couple of extra stitches just to fill any random gaps that I might see, any spots where the fabric is showing in between the white stitches. We just want it to be totally full. We're still using 2 strands. We're going to come up at the corner of that tree, and we're going to just make single stitches completely across all the way up the tree, going left to right, right to left, right to left, left to right. Again, we're just conserving thread that way. Once you get to the top of the tree, you're going to make your last horizontal stitch across. Then you're going to come up at the very tippy top of the tree and you're going to come down that diagonal edge of the tree right down into the end of your last horizontal line. Come up on the outside of your last diagonal stitch right about where the center would be, and you're going to make a diagonal stitch across and down. It's going to be on the outside of the tree line and in between your top two horizontal lines. Now we're going to create diagonal stitches all the way down the tree. We're going to be working on the outside of the tree line. So I'm going to come up in between that second and third row, and I'm going to go across and down in between the third and the fourth row. Then I'm going to move down in between the fourth and fifth row, and I'm going to go across to the other side in between the fifth and sixth row. So back and forth like that, always moving across and down a layer. Now I'll go back up to the top and I'll start on the opposite side and I will come across doing the same thing. And this, you're basically just making X's. Once you've laid down this foundation, everything past this point is just going to be random stitches going across the tree. So you're going to do them in varying angles, some straight, some diagonal, steeper diagonal, just varying your stitches so that you can fill the tree as much as you'd like, and you can make it as sparse or as full as you want to. The main idea here is that you want to have varying angles to your stitches so that it gives the illusion of branches. Also going in hand with that is that the edges of your stitches, you don't want them to all be in line with each other. You want them to have varying lengths away from that original triangle shape, because if they're all just right in a row right along that triangle line, it's just going to look like a triangle. So you have to have some of them reaching out a little bit further, some of them pulling a little bit short. That's going to give that nice branch-like feel. Definitely make sure there's no gaps like right above the stump, because that's going to make the stump look weird. It's going to look like it just ends. You can stop whenever you feel like you have a happy little tree, like Bob Ross. Repeat that same step with the other trees. For the trees that are overlapping, you're going to have covered up like the corner of those trees. So you can use your needle like I am here, or you can look at your outline in your printout to see where the corners of that tree will be. And you can just come up right in your existing stitches. You're not going to mess them up, and you're just going to do the exact same technique. At the bottoms of the trees, you can make extra little stitches that come out from the edges of the stump to add a little extra flavor to the tree, just to make it look a little bit more decorative at the bottom, a little extra branches here and there. I feel like it does make a big difference. For the North Star, we're still using 2 strands and you're only making 6 stitches, okay? You're going to come up at the very top of the vertical line. You're going to dive down to the very bottom of that line and make a single stitch. Then you're going to use the tip of your needle to kind of separate those 2 strands of thread so that there's no twisting in them. This is very important. It's got to be laying side by side. So you can see what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of raking right through it. So now they're laying side by side and I can see the gap in the center. Now I'm going to make a single stitch across that horizontal line. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to use my needle to rake through that stitch so that I can get the 2 strands lying side by side and I can see the gap in between. Now I'm going to come up at the end of one of the diagonal points and I'm going to come down into the very center of these crosshairs. So I'm going to actually separate all of them so that I can come into the center without actually grabbing any of that thread. I'm just going right down in the center, splitting all of that. Now I'll repeat that same process on the other 3 diagonal points, coming up on the outer end and then diving into that same hole in the center. And there's your little North Star. For the snow falling in the background, we're just using 2 strands and we're just doing seed stitches. So you're coming up through the fabric and then you're diving back down into the fabric really close to where you came up, just not in the same hole. And I'm changing the orientation of the stitch every time. So I like to work around the outer border of the hoop initially because it helps me kind of lay the groundwork to make it even so that it's not clumped up in any one section of the background. So you'll see that I'm kind of keeping these stitches about the same distance apart around the outer edge, and that's gonna just kind of act as like a grid for me when I'm filling in the rest of the space. But I'm changing the orientation, like I said, some of them are vertical, some of them are horizontal, some of them are diagonal. I'm doing it totally random. I just want them all to look slightly different. I'm not being particular about it at all. Like I said, this is a very kind of abstract piece, so don't get hung up on making it perfect. Now for the snow on the ground, the snowy hill here, we're going to be doing a modified stem stitch. So you're going to be using 4 strands for this one, so it's thicker, 4 strands. We're going to come up and you're going to make a single stitch less than a centimeter or so long, okay? And you're going to not fully close that stitch. You're going to kind of hold it up out of the way. It doesn't matter how much of a loop it is. You're just holding it out of the way. Now you're going to come up right in the center of that stitch. Pull all the way through and then close. So don't mind me, I just pulled up a little bit of a fray. So now you're going to make another stitch across about the same distance as the first stitch was. Pull through, don't let it close, just hold it up out of the way, and then you're going to come up somewhere in the center. And then pull closed, and then repeat. Advance forward. Don't let it close, hold it out of the way, and then come up somewhere in the center, in between where that last stitch ended and this stitch ended. Pull through. And you're just going to keep repeating that all the way down the line. Once you get to the end, just make a single stitch into the very edge of that hoop. So you're as close as to that inner wooden hoop as you can get. Then you'll just move down to the row below and again, coming up as close to that wooden hoop edge as you can. And you're gonna create the same pattern across to the left, making a single stitch, holding it out of the way, coming up in the center, and then advancing forward. So same exact stitch, just to the left. Once you get to the end of this line, you'll just move down to the next row and repeat the same pattern. If at any point you run out of thread kind of in the middle of your row, that's totally fine. Just make a single stitch like you're advancing forward and actually pull it all the way closed. Then you can flip over and tie off in the back as usual. And then when you grab a new piece of thread, just kind of lift that one up out of the way, that last stitch you made, and then just pick up where you left off. So you'll advance forward again and hold it out of the way and keep it cruising. Once you get down to the end, you're just going to make as close to the bottom as you can get it, continuing to make stitches. Now, don't worry so much about the pattern here. You're just trying to fill the space at the very bottom of the circle of your hoop. From this point on, you're just going to be filling in any gaps that are left over. So for me, I like to have the snowy landscape here, like totally full. So any spots where I still see green or red, I'm going to come in and just make single stitches to fill that space. So you'll see me just kind of hop around this whole snowy landscape and just filling in the gaps. You'll use the same techniques in the other hoops, and now I'll show you how to make the crescent moon and full moon. For the full moon, we're using 2 strands and a simple satin stitch. So you're just going from top to bottom to create single stitches to fill the space. Try to keep your stitches really close together. If you make one stitch and you feel like it was a little bit too far apart, you can always take it out, or you can just squeeze another stitch in right in between. To make the edges rounded, kind of come up on an angle right underneath your last stitch and that border of the circle, and then you're going to dive down the same way, kind of angled underneath your previous stitch. This is going to round off that side of the circle. Once you have the space filled, you're going to kind of go over it again with almost like a second layer, just adding stitches where you feel like you need to help create a more circular shape so that you can get more of a true circle, especially if your first layer came out a little bit wonky, if it wasn't a perfect circle. This is a great opportunity to kind of even out those borders by adding extra stitches, making your circle a little bit more true. So you can see I'm not going in the exact same stitches that I was last time. I'm maybe starting a little bit higher, a little bit lower to try to even out my circle. For the crescent moon, we're also going to be using 2 strands, and we're going to be doing a back split stitch. You'll come up at the peak of your moon, and then you're going to move along your outer guideline. You're going to make a single stitch and pull all the way through. Now you'll advance forward underneath the fabric about the same distance as your first stitch, and then you're going to pierce your first stitch in half lengthwise. Now again, you'll move forward underneath the fabric the same distance, and then you'll pierce that last stitch in half lengthwise. The smaller you make your stitches, the more control you'll have over this stitch. What's nice about this stitch is that you can use the tip of your needle to kind of guide where you want to pierce that last stitch. So you can kind of graze over the threads and pull them into the position that you want them to be, and then pierce it down into the fabric. Once you reach the peak, you're just going to hop over to the other side of the crescent moon and create the same pattern. On this side, it's a little easier to see how I'm moving the threads over before I pierce them into place. This is helping me keep that really nice curve. Now I'm going to fill the inside of the crescent moon with that same stitch. If there are any blank spots left over, you can just add single stitches to fill the space. If you need to, you can add an extra stitch at either end of the crescent to give it a little extra point. That concludes the tutorial for the Winter's Night ornament. I hope you enjoyed it. If you need help backing your hoops, just head back to my YouTube channel and there is a full tutorial on how to do that. Make sure you follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Sherwood Forest Creations and subscribe here on YouTube. Thanks, guys.